Hello, friends who exist to me as ideas separated from your physical selves. Have you ever felt alienated? Have you ever felt physically alienated, emotionally or socially alienated, existentially alienated? It seems as though there are as many ways to be alienated as there are ways to prepare a potato-based dish. But to understand its development, let's begin with the alienation of self. First, there was physicality. Then there was consciousness. Consciousness developed first as an emergent property of a developing brain responding to a developing environment existing concurrently with developing social relations. With developing social relations came developments of communication and the concept of a self. This concept of a self wasn't simply the rudimentary separation of self and predator or self and environment. That conception of self is possible at an instinctual level, that of the limbic system, and doesn't require any conscious awareness. But the concept of self that I'm talking about is an outgrowth of that concept of self. The limbic conception of self separates you from the other and creates a need for connection. Thus, the new conception of self fulfills that need, and it serves to fulfill the need through the creation of identity. This identity is a narrative that acts as a conduit to express oneself to the other in order to foster understanding and, additionally, connection. An identity is no doubt useful, and it is something that we cannot do without. However, there's an unfortunate side effect. Another symptomatic outgrowth. Yet another emergent property. That is the separation of the self from one's physical existence. Not to be confused with mind-body dualism. Identity is a property of material processes in the brain. The perceived separation between identity and biology is the first seed of alienation. Soon after, sprinkled across the landscape, came humanity. With humanity came further developments of cognitive capacity in response to various needs such as the creation of tools. Also, the donning of clothing. Tools and clothing, though initially for pragmatic considerations, eventually had emergent properties of their own. They became tools for expressing identity. Art adorning the walls of a cave, and the clothing and accessories adorning one's body screamed, "This is me!" They become a part of ourselves, but only ourselves in terms of the identity we form. They obviously are not part of our physical bodies. They are separate. In terms of clothing, it goes a step further. It covers our physical bodies. It obscures our vision of our bodies. Out of sight, out of mind. Now, alienation can fester as we direct our attention to the expression and away from our natural form. We now become preoccupied and spend a majority of our time building, layer upon layer, atop our identities. Our higher cognitive selves become abstracted and become associated with the clothed body, since that is what we see most in our day-to-day lives. When the clothes come off, suddenly we are not ourselves. We become reduced to the limbic, libidinal self, because this form is only revealed in front of another to perform the instinctual, sexual act of intercourse. Higher cognitive function is stripped away. We become sexualized. In place of language, there are instead grunts and moans. Some have mastered the transition from one state to the other. Some become disgusted by their biological functions or existence. This type of alienation is not gender dysphoria. This type of alienation is universal. It affects all human beings at some level, whether consciously so or not. Gender dysphoria is more specific and complex. It is more complex because the brain is complex. It is related to one's identity becoming alienated from their physical form, but involves structural factors that delve much deeper than just the areas of the brain concerned with higher cognition and identity development. Even though it doesn't need to be said for those who know my political alignment, I will reaffirm that your gender identity is valid. Interestingly enough, this brings me to the solution for both types of alienation. For both types, it is unifying the cognitive and the physical. For one, it is the cognitive accepting the physical as an expression of its identity. For the other, it is altering the physical to bring it into harmony with identity expression. Trans rights are human rights. The alienation of self doesn't only exist as a dichotomy between one identity and body, but also as an extension of the body being removed from one's possession. The products of human creation are indeed an extension of the body. Tools, art, and general objects of use are products of human labor, which is an accumulation of the time and energy from thought and action that is used in the creation of said object. This transference of energy connects the object to yourself. There is always a degree of your identity transcribed into the object of your creation, though it is less so with something like a tool and more so with art. But in either case, it is something that emanates from within you. When something you created is taken from you, you have then lost a piece of yourself. When someone claims ownership over what you have created, without proper exchange and without any indication of the labor you poured into that process, it is as if it had never been a part of you to begin with. This is the type of alienation that Marx writes about in Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts in 1844, concerning the alienating nature of capitalism. In the same essay, Marx discusses how the alienation of labor, which is a form of alienation of self, due to the structure of capitalism, then leads to social alienation, human from human. The most obvious forms of social alienation are that of class antagonisms, bourgeoisie from the proletariat. But it exists also within each class. Within and between each class is brutal competition. I used the signifier brutal to distinguish the competition from whatever playful or non-serious preconception someone might have concerning competition. This competition is serious because it is concerned with livelihood. And when livelihood is at stake, competitive attitudes become vicious. Competition built into the economy does not create an atmosphere conducive to social cohesion. This competition can pull apart friends and families. Even the most well-meaning leftist community can be susceptible to this toxicity. And soon you have a problem with toxic masculine standards and toxic feminine standards. Competition thrives at the heart of racism and sexism. This atmosphere breeds stress and anxiety, and when an alternative arrives to social interaction that allows one to retreat to safety, suddenly every individual becomes isolated. This is what happened with the advent of the internet. However, the internet, though it allowed refuge, didn't drown the need for desire or social interaction. People, now isolated, simply found ways to reconnect using various programs that eventually led to the prolific use of social media today. Now the toxicity has simply moved online, with the addition of being even more vicious with the misconceived safety of anonymity and conditions ripe for detachment. Communities have become increasingly and gradually splintered, and even with near constant online interaction, a significant proportion of the population have never felt so lonely. Alienation. A single word that lies at the heart of so many social ills. It tears the individual from themselves. It tears the creation of an individual from the hands that create it. And it tears the individual apart from other individuals, effectively disintegrating our society. It is also the sole motivator and extinguisher of revolutionary potential. Alienation has even crept in and corrupted me. Because the joke is that, at the epitome of this video, I have simply been isolated in my room, talking to no one but myself. Tier 3, Bobby Fischer.